I'm standing in the middle of Jahrsau, a small village in the center of Germany with only a couple of farms and a small chapel dating from the 14th century. Well, as you can see around me, not much is left of it. All inhabitants had to leave their houses already decades ago, although they had done nothing wrong. Let me explain you what happened.
In 1952, the East German government issued a regulation that contained a new set of measures directing a total closure of the border to West Germany. At the full length of the inner German border, a barbed wire barrier and 10-meter control strip were installed. East Germany closed its border to the west because each year thousands of people left the country to start a new life in West Germany. In 1951 only, more than 160,000 East German refugees were registered in West Germany. If you want to know how it came to the split of Germany, then check this video, where I explain how after the Second World War, tensions between East and West Germany kept increasing, which eventually resulted in two different states. Next to the barbed wire fence and the 10-meter control strip, in May 1952, the area up to 500 meters from the border was marked as protective strip and the area up to 5 kilometers from the border was marked as restricted zone. All people living in this area were registered and got a stamp in their ID. In the protective strip, hotels and restaurants even had to close and public events were forbidden. A secret operation called Operation Vermin, Aktion Ungeziefer, was planned, in which a list was created by the police and state security of all people that lived in the border area that they thought could not be trusted and that might want to escape to the west. The people in this list were divided in different categories, amongst others, foreigners and stateless persons, persons that frequently passed the border to West Germany, for example for their daily work, people that recently came from the west, political unreliable persons, people that just did not fit into the communist regime, but also there were categories like people with criminal records, Jehovah's Witnesses and former Nazis. All these people were to be expelled from their homes. The actual expulsion was to almost all people a terrible experience. Early in the morning the police would knock on the door and inform the inhabitants that they had to move out. Protest and resistance were violently suppressed, sometimes also resulting in imprisonment. Often the people were told that leaving their houses would only be a temporary measure until both Germanys would be united again. Lots of people drew strength from the hope that the resettlement would only be for a limited period of time. All house doors were sealed when the people had left their homes. People were not told where they would be settled to. Some even thought it would be Poland or Siberia. The available new housing for the resettled people was insufficient. In the federal state of Saxony-Anhalt, for example, for 337 families consisting out of more than 3 persons each, only 78 houses were available. Also, the quality of the new homes that were offered was mostly much worse than what the people originally had. People were put into former warehouses and even into stables. The expelled people had to leave family and friends behind, and in their new domicile they had often been announced as dangerous criminals. Lots of families came to live in completely far-out locations with very bad transport connections. Many victims stated that they were also under observation in their new living environment. Documents that have become accessible only recently confirm this. Operation Vermin had not been very well prepared and organized by the state. The timing between informing the people and the actual transportation to their new homes sometimes lasted up to several days. Therefore, luckily, many people were able to flee to the west after they had heard that they would be resettled. There were also lots of issues with the transportation of the people's property. Often, train carriages had to be arranged, which, due to scarcity, would only be available at night. A big part of the resettled people were farmers. For them it was of course impossible to move all of their equipment and animals. After completion of Operation Vermin, almost 900 farms along the inner German border were left abandoned. By mid-June 1952, the forced resettlements were finished. About 8,500 people had been moved to another area of the country. Although it was not officially reported, it is clear that the operation had resulted in serious psychological harm to victims. For most of the people, it was a traumatic experience they had to deal with for the rest of their lives. A few people could not deal with it at all and chose to commit suicide. It seems logical to think that after the resettlements, only politically reliable people were left in the border area. However, this is a myth. The fact that the protest in the villages in the border area had stopped didn't mean that all inhabitants agreed with what had happened. Inhabitants of the protective strip and restricted zone still had to be careful not being selected for resettlement, so it was quite logical that they chose to keep their mouths shut. Unfortunately, the story doesn't stop here. In 1961, so 9 years later, the Berlin Wall was built. Until then, it had been very easy to leave East Germany by just fleeing to West Berlin. In 1961, the Berlin Wall ended all of this. As a result, more attempts to leave the country were done again on the inner German border. Therefore, the East German government planned a second secret operation to again expel thousands of people from their homes, called Operation Consolidation, Aktion Festigung. Based on the experience collected in 1952, this time the resettlement actions were set up much more thoroughly in order to avoid that the news would spread and that people would escape before their secretly planned resettlement. State security, the Stasi, was leading the operation. Detailed scripts had been prepared, which included strict timings and the instructions that the police had to give regarding the change of residence. The categories in which the people that were forced to leave were divided were similar to the ones in 1952. The actual operation was performed on October 3, 1961. 8 to 12 people, most of them policemen and state security per family. They would knock on the door early in the morning and ask to be let in. Then they would read a declaration speaking of aggressive measures from West Germany that would require the inhabitants to move more inland. Only very seldom consideration was shown towards sick, pregnant or old people. According to the reports, several cases of mental breakdowns, heart attacks, suicide threats or attempted suicide were reported. Many victims report that they got someone following them to avoid that they would commit suicide. This time, in total 3,175 people were resettled, which is 1% of the total population in the border area. Difference compared to the resettlements in the 50s is that the population in the border area had a high concentration of border police, state security officers in between them that had already been collecting personal information for years. It was not rare that the reasons for resettlement were personal or just because the victim was known by the police for a couple of insignificant breaches, like insults of police officers. Envy also played a role, for example, when people had a lot of contacts in the West that got them a better financial position. Although reports from the police and secret police state that the new housing of the deported people was equivalent or better than what they had, this did not correspond to reality. Like in 1952, people were put into former stables and warehouses that only had gotten a bit of fresh paint. What also was similar to 1952 is the new jobs the resettled people got. They often did not match their qualifications. 4 weeks after the completion of the operation, the East German government decided that the deported people should be compensated for the property that they had left behind. This was mostly a compensation in kind, which meant that the government decided where the people had to go to live. An important reasoning behind compensating was also that all links with the border area would be cut if the people wouldn't have any property over there anymore. So, no reason to go back, no risk of escapes. The Operation Consolidation is probably one of the biggest operations ever undertaken in the German Democratic Republic, taking into account the planning, reporting, evaluation and post-processing, like handling of complaints, post-transporting and calculation of compensation payments.
Back to Jahrsau. Jahrsau is located in East Germany, just on the border between the federal states of Lower Saxony, that was West Germany, and Saxony-Anhalt, that was East Germany. Actually, it was so close to the border that it was easy for people that lived here to flee to the west, which also happened regularly in all border areas. The East German government often decided to remove all buildings that were close to the border area. Therefore, Jahrsau was just in the way to have a free field of fire. In 1961, the last inhabitants were expelled, and in 1970 the buildings were torn down. And this is what's left of it. That's it for today. I hope you found this video interesting, and if you have any questions or comments, feel free to put them in the section below. Thanks for watching.